Shy audience today, but nevertheless, we're very excited today to be presenting by four organizations. Just as a reminder, this session is being led by the World Benchmarking Alliance, Proforest, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And it will feature the presentation of the World Benchmarking Alliance's 2023 Food and Agriculture Benchmark, assessing the world's 350 most influential food and agriculture companies on their performance to contribute to healthier, more sustainable and equitable food systems. This will be followed by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development sharing their work with the private sector on how increasing food and nutrition security, and as well highlighting the role of corporate commitment in closing the accountability gap. And then with Proforest presenting their Africa Sustainable Commodity Initiative as a functional multi-stakeholder platform for responsible commodity agriculture in Central and West Africa. And then this will be complemented by the Access to Nutrition Initiative's assessment of the largest global food and beverage manufacturers and retailers on their commitments and performance in nutrition in specific. So you'll be listening by four organizations, four initiatives. It's going to be data intensive as well. And I think I could start by saying that I think we've also heard at the Food Systems Summit that you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And today you're going to be at least shown some data from these organizations about the performance of the private sector in several measurement areas and as well in food security. Just a quick timekeeping. We're going to start with the World Benchmarking Alliance's presentation of the 2023 benchmark. This will be followed by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development for 10 minutes. And then we'll move on to Proforest for 15 minutes. And then we'll have a 30 minutes Q&A. So the audience is also more than welcome to ask questions. And we'll also be having a panel discussion at the same time for 30 minutes. And finally, I will call on Mrs. Sylvia Akra, the Deputy Director of the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub, to give a closing from the hub side. All right, so without further ado, Victoria, if you'd like to begin your presentation. Yes. I can do it.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here. And actually, before I'm going into the food and agriculture benchmark results, I want to recognize, of course, the fact that this side event is hosted at CFS 51, which is focusing on food security. And I think we can't go beside the fact that to recognize that the biggest acute threat to food security is man-made conflict, as we are seeing in Gaza every day, but sadly also in other many conflicts around the world. So really want to start this off by respecting the right to food, and that is paramount to realize food security worldwide. Having said that, the CFS has brought many useful tools as well for governments as for the private sector to improve food security and nutrition. Naming a few is, of course, CFS's principles for responsible investment in agriculture and food systems, known as the RIE principles, and also the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries and forests in the context of national food security, known as VGGT. And I'm mentioning this because my organization, the World Benchmarking Alliance, WBA, has attempted to bring these global standards and global metrics together in assessing the 350 largest food and agriculture companies. So bringing in these types of standards, looking at whether companies are actually implementing them. These CFS guidelines are just a few, but just as well on social equity side, we're of course looking at ILO standards that have been available for over 10 years, but also the science-based targets on environment. Now I have to see if, yes, the presentation is working. Great. We've launched the Food and Agriculture Benchmark 2 weeks ago, and I'm excited to share with you the tip of the iceberg, part of the results, but also mentioning that there's so much more to tell, and that we're very eager to work in partnerships with stakeholders in this room and beyond on specific topics. So this will be an introduction into the things that we've measured and pulling out a few highlights, but of course there's much more to be delved into and much more in-depth results that will be coming out. Interestingly, we had in the top 25, so our first benchmark was published 2 years ago. This time around, 2 years later, we have taken stock really on where things are standing. And we see that there's quite some shakeup in the top performing companies. We are also encouraged to see quite some global south headquartered companies that are improving on their performance, and 2 companies of them are in the top 10 as well. Of course, there's still a big chunk that is non-transparent, that is not engaging, that it also is not present at events like these. CFS was always known as an important event where the private sector came together with the UN food agencies, and usually in these settings, great partnerships can be made. So it's important to note that while companies have still a long way to go, there are some leading practices and good examples that can be of inspiration for peers across the sectors. So I will share 5 key findings with you. As said, we have over 46 different indicators, and we also did a deep dive on more nature-specific indicators. So there's much more. You can reach out to us one-on-one later on. But I would like to start off with farmers, with really the start of the value chain and the most important piece, I'd say, when we look at the food value chains. We've also looked a bit more deeper into these 350 companies. How are they related to especially small-scale producers? And just purely based on what companies are reporting already, so this is the bare minimum, we have seen that these 350 companies reach at least 75 million small-scale producers based in over 40 low and middle income countries. So that goes to show that even these big corporates have a very direct link to small-scale producers, and so can be a very important driver into improving livelihoods in that area. Over almost 100 companies, so that's a third of the companies, are supporting farmers' income through procurement and pricing practices. So they're paying more for the goods that they are sourcing, which is a great example. However, the next step would, of course, be to really see whether that is bridging the income gap. And you always see this different step methodology around. First, you have to have awareness as a company, the impact that you are creating. Then you have to have activities to create that impact, but also you have to have activities to make sure that you're creating the biggest impact possible. So a third of companies is already on the way, but it's only 4% of companies, so specifically 13 out of 350, that are actually identifying the living income gaps in the specific regions, which is of course the leading practice where other companies should be heading towards to as well. A second finding I'd like to share with you is on nutrition specifically. We find that always, so we look at environmental, social equity, and nutritional thematic topics, and nutrition is always the measurement area where companies score the weakest, unfortunately. It's really, I wouldn't say, but I'll ask Maria later to comment from the Access to Nutrition initiative on whether it's on the radar or whether it's the willingness, where lies the difference, but that we don't see better results. But we focused here on the slide that we're sharing with you on the consumer-facing companies, while we also have nutritional asks of more the agriculture companies. Those lie in crop diversity and in more improving the nutritional value of crops, etc. But if we look at consumer-facing companies, which of course have the biggest impact on people's nutritional intake, we see that only 18% are actually reformulating their products, and it's only 5 companies, so it's less than 1%, that have set a sales target to increase the sales of healthy foods. And we considered to take out specifically restaurants and food service providers, because also 2 years ago, that was the only segment across the whole value chain that was not represented in the top 10. This time around as well, it's not represented in the top 25. And it seems like that part of the value chain is really lagging behind. And of course, we all know that in specific areas, you can think of Asia, where out-of-home meals are a daily reoccurrence, that this is very important, that also the food and restaurant companies are stepping up to the plate, literally, to improve their menus, to reduce, for example, salt, sugar, and fats in their menus and products, and also really stick themselves to having a target set on that. So there's a lot of room to improve there. But from the 5 companies that are setting sales targets, it's interesting to note that 4 out of the 5 are retailers. So that is they really try to play a pivotal role in also incentivizing the food and beverage manufacturers to step up and to have a more healthier portfolio. Then going over to climate, the third finding I'd like to share with you here today. There's lots of stats. Please take a picture of it. And as I said, everything is online and can be checked in more detail. We've looked at scope 1 and 2 and separately on scope 3. The graph here is about scope 3 because we were quite encouraged to see that there was a doubling of companies that are setting science-based targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in scope 3. Aligned with the 1.5 degrees, so that 2 years ago it was only 7 companies, now it's 13. It's still a long way to go, as you see, but there is some movement. And what I want to point out here as well is, look, around 50% of companies are setting a target. Then a fraction of that are setting science-based target or reporting progress against their target. But to realize net zero by 2030, we need to halt deforestation. That is one of the #1 biggest impacts that we can do as food and agriculture companies. And Proforest will speak on this more. But actually, we've only seen that 6% of companies are setting time-bound targets to eliminate deforestation. And we know it should actually be eliminated already by 2025. So in 2 years' time, it needs to be eliminated to make sure that we reach those net zero targets. So you can think of, okay, how are these climate actions really translated into being implemented in a way that they can be realized? Relating to climate and also becoming a bit of a buzzword, I'd say, is regenerative agriculture. And we wanted to highlight this as well in the findings, because it's a term that is broadly adopted by businesses and stakeholders alike. There's lots of conferences around this, lots of attention, which is great, hailed as a big solution to also sequester carbon in the soil, improve the nutritional value of crops by making sure that the soil becomes more healthy, that there's more biodiversity in and around the farmland. So we've tried to delve into the specifics on what companies are actually meaning with this, and how we as WBA look at it from different lenses. So one paramount first step is having the ambition to improve soil health. Well, that's heading quite well. 51% of companies are working on that. Then comes a very important piece of regenerative agriculture, making sure that farmers are paid for their services. Farmers need to realize, of course, all these sustainability practices on the land. As mentioned earlier around living income, 1/3 of companies are actually paying a premium to farmers for these practices, so that is good. But as I mentioned, there's still a gap with really looking at bridging poverty levels. But 1/3 has that on the radar and is actively working towards it. What was interesting for us to note is that when you look at the inputs, it's far less. So it's only 9% of companies that are optimizing their fertilizer use, and even less, only 4% that are minimizing the use of pesticides, which to many stakeholders is considered also one of the crucial elements of having a truly regenerative agriculture practice. So again, it's a several step process where you see that companies usually have about 50% of companies, which if you look at 350, it's a lot. It's around 180 companies that are taking a first step, but it's still, we need to push and we need to work hard to make sure that it's holistic, it is really implemented in a way to realize results. Then the final finding is generally on sustainability strategy, just pulling this out to give you this example as well. More than 50% of companies are undertaking a materiality assessment, so really have an awareness of the fact that they should be putting sustainability at the center of their business and that they are actually interested on how they can do it. But then only 8% of companies, so 27, are also implementing that through target setting. So half of companies know what they should be doing, but it's only less than 10% that are then taking actions to make it work. And that overall made us feel to sort of share that, well, we see that 90% of companies are really not there yet to realize the SDGs. Overall, 50% of companies roughly are, having an awareness, really working on getting this integrated, looking where they're more, they can create their biggest impact. But it's less than 10% that have a really concrete strategy forward. Now, with that said, we do see that there's leading practices in many different areas. So while no one company has the highest scores in every stage, the encouraging thing in this data set, which is massive, and we've published the Excel sheet with all the 350 companies' results on all the 46 indicators, and each 46 indicator has at least 4, sometimes 6 elements. All of that is published on our website, and you can pick and disseminate it with us, or just getting into the Excel sheet yourselves. Further, there's so much data out there to be inspired to see what is actually already put into practice and what works. And to top it off, this is just to share the top 10 of the food and agriculture benchmark, as well as the nature benchmark. So in nature, we have looked at the same companies this year, but they're more specifically on ecosystems, as well as the social equity side from, for example, indigenous communities. And you see that even the #1 companies are not fully there yet. And you see #1 in the food and agriculture benchmark is scoring 67 out of 100 points. So there's still much room for improvement, but we hope that with these data points and findings, we can share inspiration about what is already being done in the field, where are the leading practices, and how can we make sure to not just incentivize businesses, but really as a stakeholder community, also hold businesses to account to realize the SDGs, because obviously it's only through public and private and stakeholder civil society efforts that we can leave no one behind and work to the 2030 agenda. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and Victoria, thanks very much for your insightful presentation and also keeping the business community sharp, I think. I don't know whether I would want to show this report card if I were to come home, 6.7, but this clearly shows that there is more to be done. Nothing's happening. Keyboard. But Victoria was able to. Yeah. No?
There it is.
Anyway, it's my pleasure this morning, and I'll have 10 minutes to talk to you a little bit about the work that we're doing within the World Business Council. And the title is "How Can the Private Sector Help Increase Food Security and Nutrition?" Oh, I think everyone can hear me. It's not like it's completely full here. Very quickly, I mean, we will also make the slides available. But the World Business Council is a CEO-led organization. Have some 200 leading companies, and we work together with accelerating system transformation and ultimately move to net zero, nature positive, and for equitable futures. Those are also the imperatives which are key for the World Business Council. So here's an overview of some of the companies that are members, and it's good to see Nestlé also and BASF present here, who are members of the World Business Council. In the work that we are doing for food and security nutrition, actually it was a task force that was set up early this year, also basically because there was a question, the private sector needs to step up, and there has been a lot of criticism also on the private sector that apparently not enough is being done on this topic. And so we are focusing thereby by strengthening the visibility of what's happening, also create a common action plan, what can be done in the ag and food sector, identify the opportunities that are there for the private and public partnerships, and also in the report that will be out towards COP28, we will also try to have a playbook of some best practices in that sense. Anyway, it's a concerning situation that we are in. I mean, if I look at also what the Secretary General said, I think it was in September, we're halfway on the action for the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, this is a report card that is not showing that we're doing well. And particularly in the area of nutrition, livelihoods, this is very, very concerning. So something certainly needs to be done in that area. If you look at the action that is required for food security, one thing we know is that towards 2050, we're going to need to feed 2 billion more people on this planet. And if you look at what is required in terms of food production, roughly, I mean, these are estimates, but around 56 to 60% is needed more than in 2010. So that's a lot. As mentioned, we're off track on the SDGs. And if you look at the work that's been done, and I think you've showed that also in terms of what your research shows, that the corporate accountability on this needs to improve. So you also mentioned only 27 companies have comprehensive targets. So a lot of work needs to be done on that. And if you look also at the other issue that was mentioned on bridging living income gaps, only 4% of the companies really have a focus on that. And also if you dig a little bit deeper in the research, I think it showed also that the companies in sub-Saharan Africa, I think, had the lowest score in the World Business ICE ranking. So clearly more work needs to be done also by the private sector in that area. There's also some good news. If you look at the rankings, if you look at the World Business Council members, then actually 8 of them are in the top 10. So you can see that those companies are trying to make a difference, and I think that's a very positive thing to mention. But again, this is only a few out of those 350 that have been analyzed by the World Benchmarking Alliance. We're facing a triple challenge in order to ensure that we have healthy, nutritious food, and also that this is done within planetary boundaries. I mentioned before the 2 billion additional people that we have to feed. And this triple challenge is about providing food and security nutrition for this growing population. But at the same time, we're already at 800 million undernourished. 3 billion have no access to healthy diets. And on the other hand, 2.5 billion are already today overweight. So there's something wrong in our system. It's also important to realize that we're dealing with 560 million farmers worldwide, and 500 million of them are actually in smallholder farmers with smaller than 2 hectares. The other thing I think that was also mentioned yesterday or the day before yesterday here in CFS is that a lot of these are also women farmers, and we are still, I think it took 3 years to talk about voluntary acceptance on empowerment of women's rights and girls' rights. And so that this is a concerning issue also because they made such an important impact on this. The other thing is food and agri has an enormous environmental footprint on our planet. A third of the greenhouse gas emissions, we waste and have a lot of food loss. 50% of the agricultural lands are moderately and severely degraded, and we're already using 70% of fresh water. These are really concerning developments. And so our food system is also the primary driver of biodiversity loss. Now, if we then move on to where are the areas of food security the greatest, and then the Global Food Security Index really shows that that is in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is the most. And if you then look at the population projections, of that 2 billion that I mentioned, 60%, the 1.1 billion, is going to be there by 2050. And already this is in a region where famine risk and food security are high. We have a number of undernourished people above the pre-pandemic levels. So this is a very concerning situation, I think, for all of us, if we do not take action and do not resolve some of the issues that we have faced there. Now, if you look at beyond, if you look at the projections, and these are rough projections, the question is, can we accept that we're going to have 1.2 billion people hungry on our planet, of which 500 million in Africa? And I think that's something we have to really consider also as a private sector. Now, on the sheet you also see a number of the drivers for food security in Africa. We look at, of course, there's some colonial legacies, poor governance, climate and environmental challenges. But I think it's the aggravation triggers that are also very concerning. They are related to change of climate change, that we're going to see more weather events and with higher frequencies in terms of flooding, droughts, heat waves, fires. Food and energy transportation pricing has also increased substantially. What we also see is the local inflation, and some of the things that are often forgotten is the fact that we see a huge currency depreciation taking place in a lot of the countries in Africa. And that is also aggravating actually the debt position of many of the countries. So that's a very concerning economic environment that's happening now that is getting a little bit more attention. But this is quite of a concern because a lot of food is also imported. And you can understand that foreign exchange reserves are being depleted. And also with the debts that need to be repaid, we are going to be facing increasing problems there. Now, the private sector has a strong role to play in this. I think we need to look at how we can create more efficiencies in the production and supply chains and do this within planetary boundaries. Innovation is important, have scalable technology available, provide the know-how in order to help alleviate this situation. And we need to help reduce the risk, look at the vulnerabilities there, and sustain and create business and market opportunities. Now, clearly, this is not something that the private sector can do on its own. And this needs to be done by cooperation with the public sector, the multilaterals, government associations. Otherwise, this is not going to work. And that is also related to the risks that the private sector faces in some of these regions. And ultimately, the private sector is transactional in what it does. And in the areas that they operate, we need to address the risk and have a risk appetite that is acceptable. Now, we've looked at the 6 dimensions of food security and nutrition. So ultimately here, it's also collaboration that is needed with the commercial banks, with MFIs, we need to work with NGOs. It's academia that's important in resolving some of these issues, and ultimately organizations like where we're here today at the FOO for the CFS and governments. We've also then identified a number of areas where we think food security is important, where the private sector can act. And so it's about sustainable intensification of local production in certain areas, accelerating climate resilient agriculture, unlocking financial services. Having financial access in these areas is also a struggle. And that needs to be made available. We need to look at more resilience and supply chain efficiencies and support economic and social empowerment of those local value chains. And again, it's also about enhancing consumer awareness also here and how we can help these areas. And we all think that the other surrounding is this has to be done in a sustainable manner. I'd like to say some words also about the initiatives of the Zero Hunger Pledge, and we also have Karen Smaller here. I think here this also, we call upon more companies to also respond to this. So far, we have in 48 different regions a total commitment of pledges of now some 575 million by 50 different companies. It is also concerning, however, that very few of the projects, only 7, are targeted at the high priority countries, so the countries that have a higher risk, compared to 98 in the low and 48 in the medium priority countries. Also, the Zero Hunger Pledge will issue a report on its accountability, so the pledges that are being made by the private sector are being undertaken in a proper manner. It's also good to see that if you look at the support that is there, that quite a number of the companies, also members of the World Business Council, have committed and are working to that. So again, it's an appeal to do that because it also shows commitment that is being made by the private sector. So to end, I think to resolve this triple challenge, and we can only reverse the trend that we are facing currently if we address the climate challenge and mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions in the highly emitting sectors of the agriculture and value chain. So it's not only what's happening in what I would say the hotspot areas, this is also what has to be done collectively in the rest of the world. And we need to empower the local, we're talking about local food systems there, to be more independent, be productive, resilient, and equitable and nourishing in a nature-positive manner. And we need to mobilize the public and private investments there, embrace a stronger collaboration between the private and public sector. And food security also requires economic, social governance, and stability over time. I think that's also an important point. And I'd like to end with the statement by Glenn Denning he made, imagine a world without hunger and obesity. He's the writer of the book Universal Food Security. If you haven't read it, I think it's very insightful for the challenges that we all face. Thanks, everyone. Perfect. Very good.
Great, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to both of the previous speakers for the really interesting introductions to their work on corporate responsibility around food and nutrition. My name's Sophie Higman. I'm from Proforest in the UK, and I'm actually joined online by one of my colleagues, Effia Premsa, who's from the Africa team, who can also talk as part of the panel on some of the areas that may come up. But I'd like to talk today about the Africa Sustainable Commodities Initiative, which is a regional multi-stakeholder initiative in Western Central Africa. And that may sound like a bit of a jump from the previous two presentations, but in fact, it's very linked in terms of the way that these kinds of commitments and these kinds of requirements are actually delivered in the context of production and producer countries. A couple of words about Proforest. We're a global organization, but we're locally led in 8 different countries and with a shared mission around responsible sourcing and production of agricultural and forest commodities. So we're very much focused on commodity agriculture. And we work in 2 major ways around supporting companies in the kind of supply chain action that we've just talked about, but also in supporting collaboration, multi-stakeholder initiatives and collaboration between companies pre-competitively and with governments and other stakeholders. So thinking about how we do that, as I said, we work on volumes and how companies can source certified and sustainable commodities, how they can work with their suppliers, go back through their supply chains to try and drive the kind of action and deliver on the commitments that they're making, exactly the kind of things that Victoria was talking about, but also working in landscapes and trying to work with communities and companies to invest beyond their supply chains, beyond their own individual supply chains, and to work in sectoral initiatives that can help drive change on the ground and facilitate delivery of those kinds of commitments. Building up on what Paul was saying, we clearly need agriculture to step up and to be able to have a just transition to responsible production. We're asking a lot from our agricultural systems. We're asking for food security, we're asking for employment, we're asking for livelihoods, we're asking for reduced greenhouse gas emissions and zero deforestation all at the same time, as well as the nutrition and the food security side. So there are a lot of demands happening. And if we want to have that kind of systemic change across our agricultural systems, clearly we need to have multi-stakeholder collaborations and working together to deliver all of those areas on the left around livelihoods, around protecting forests, around food security. We have to work together with communities, with producers, with small-scale producers and the companies that buy from them and the governments that provide the environment in which they work. And so that brings me to the Africa Sustainable Commodities Initiative, which is an initiative where we have tried to bring together all of those stakeholders in 10 countries in Central and West Africa. So the Africa Sustainable Commodities Initiative has grown out of the Africa Palm Oil Initiative, where we started with a commitment in 2016 at COP22 in Marrakesh from 7 governments in the region around the sustainable production of palm oil. And that was reaffirmed at COP27 last year by, in fact, 10 countries and broadened to bring in other commodities, because in each of those countries you find that where palm oil is being produced, there are other commodities being produced, commodities like cocoa and coffee and rubber. And so the kind of principles that underpin sustainable agriculture in palm oil are clearly the same things that will underpin sustainable commodity production beyond that. The initiative has local ownership, and that's really important. I think we talked about the need for local action previously. This is locally owned in each country through a focal point in each of the government ministries, because that's absolutely key to have government support and government buy-in, and with a facilitator for a multi-stakeholder platform who is drawn from civil society. So it's bringing together those 2 core stakeholders and also bringing in private sector into platforms in each of the countries. There were a number of principles that were signed up to in the declaration that was signed last year, which were building on the Palm Oil Initiative. And they are around sustainability, governance, transparency, recognition of human rights, collaboration, and equitable benefit sharing. Those are very broad principles that are then interpreted in each of the countries. into specific implementation approaches and tools, and which I'll go into in a moment. But I wanted to draw the parallel before I move on to the CFS principles of responsible investment in agriculture and food systems. Clear parallels there around engagement, around equality, around governance, around sustainable management. They are principles that can underpin the contribution that companies can make to sustainable agriculture and sustainable food systems. So the Africa Sustainable Commodities Initiative, as I said, it's regional, 10 governments in Central and West Africa with shared principles, and then in each country, a national multi-stakeholder platform, which has developed national action plans to reflect that country's context and understand how to implement those principles in each country. And then a range of different approaches to how you might do that have been used in different countries, depending on the context. So I'll give a few examples of those different implementation approaches. Supporting institutional change. That's been key in a couple of countries. For example, in Ghana, where it was the Africa Palm Oil Initiative at that time, the multi-stakeholder platform, supported the development of an agency, the Tree Crops Development Authority, which now sits under the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, for regulating those other tree crops beyond cocoa and bringing them onto a common platform and common sort of systems of regulation. And in Edo State in Nigeria, supporting the establishment of a new forestry commission and new legislation updating the forest law, which enables more sustainable allocation of lands and focus on smallholder farmers and changing that kind of policy direction to support sustainable agriculture. Similarly, around policy and strategy support, the platforms in each country have supported the development of national strategies, national plans around oil palm, with a focus on land rights, local communities, women's rights, and things like legal instruments specifically to protect forests. So for example, there in the Republic of Congo, there is a ministerial order which shifts the production of palm oil away from forests and says allocation of lands needs to be on savanna lands that don't encourage the deforestation in the country. Support for smallholders. We've talked about the importance of farmers. There are 780 million farmers in Africa. The majority of them are women, and explicitly including them at the production end in order to deliver on some of these commitments that have been mentioned and through the kind of supply chains needs a kind of explicit focus for how to involve them, how you can drive capacity, how you can make investment in increasing productivity of smallholder farmers and ensuring that their livelihoods are supported. Land rights are clearly an issue in commodity agriculture and in staple food agriculture. And one of the implementation approaches that has been developed in several countries in the Africa Sustainable Commodities Initiative is around free, prior, and informed consent. So that's a process for ensuring that local communities, indigenous people, only give authority for their lands to be used for commodity agriculture if they have given with free, prior, and informed consent. And ensuring that that's not just something that companies do voluntarily means getting that into legal instruments, getting it into guidelines that are officially authorized. And in Liberia, Edo State in Nigeria, and the Republic of Congo, the initiative has been working to develop those kinds of guidelines, building on legislation such as the Land Act in Liberia, but also developing the kinds of guidelines that mean that it's clear what those mean in different sectors and how they should be applied by companies in different contexts. Aligning with international standards. There's been a lot of work on aligning with the RSPO principles and criteria. That's the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. and incorporating those kind of requirements into legislation around land allocation, and facilitating a national interpretation of that so that it's clear what is required in each country, which makes it more accessible for production companies to actually try and meet the standard if they understand what it means in each country. So taking the global principles and interpreting them to national requirements contexts. And finally, on gender and social inclusion, I think we've all mentioned the need for women and women's farmers to be directly targeted in terms of improving agriculture and agriculture extension and capacity building that in, again, at the sort of policy level and the institutional level around gender equality, social inclusion, international plans and strategies. So what I've been talking about there very much complements the kinds of approaches that Victoria and Paul have talked about in the private sector. And it doesn't take away at all from the company responsibility to contribute to food security and responsible production practices. It emphasizes it, and it says governments need to provide that policy and institutional and legislative basis to enforce responsible production in their countries, and companies have a responsibility also to deliver and to meet that. And having that kind of level playing field with institutions and policies and legislation then allows companies to all raise their base rather than just having islands of good practice. It means that that's across the board. And we see that multi-stakeholder initiatives like the Africa Sustainable Commodities Initiative are crucial for fostering the kind of dialogue and collaboration at scale, the public-private collaboration that's been mentioned several times. Thanks very much, and I look forward to an interesting discussion.
All right, I think now we'll switch to the panel and I'll just sit next to you and then we can discuss it. So for our panel discussion, we'll first hear from our last organization, the Access to Nutrition Initiative, specifically Mrs. Mariah Busma, the Director for Strategic Alliances and External Affairs. Mariah, I'd like to ask first that you've seen in Paul's presentation that right now we're not on track. We can see hunger, we can see obesity. We also saw from the WBA benchmark that nutrition is the least performing measurement area. And so does the data by the Access to Nutrition Initiative on these companies' products and their portfolios complement these findings? What is the key message from the Access to Nutrition Initiative? Is it different from what we've seen from these two presentations, or is it complementary?
Yes, thank you very much. And let me first congratulate WBA with two new very informative benchmarks, food and agriculture benchmark and also the nature benchmark, which is particularly the food and agriculture benchmark is a very valuable tool for the Access to Nutrition Initiative and for our own nutrition indexes. Because it also gives us a chance in between the global indexes that we produce to measure progress of the companies that are overlapping in our two benchmarks. Another topic that I also wanted to shortly say something about is that it gives ADNI, that is doing a deep dive in nutrition for companies, the possibility to also look at how companies are performing on broader sustainability issues, including climate. And yesterday there was an interesting session about climate and nutrition that mentioned actually that none of the companies in FAB 21 and neither in FAB 23 are both prioritizing nutrition and climate at the same time, which is a big gap, I would say, so something that we all together should work on. So yes, ADNI assesses the food and beverage manufacturers and increasingly also retailers in our global indexes and also increasingly in country indexes. And I'm very grateful to be in this panel today because to focus also on processed foods that are part of our food systems. And Paul also mentioned, yeah, there is availability of foods, but also we need to look at the quality of foods and the nutritious processed foods, which are also part of our system and needs to be discussed, particularly also on an international fora like CFS, where we are now. Because 1/3 of the global world population is still malnourished, but simultaneously, or part of that, is that 40% of the adults are overweight or obese. And this number is expected to grow, particularly in areas that are actually where there's a lot of vulnerable people living, because if we look at, well, where population growth is, where market growth is, where the highest retail growth is, we're mostly looking at certain economies, and particularly in Africa. Back to your question and the food and agriculture benchmark, ADNI agrees very much with the key message that WBA gives on the results of nutrition, that companies do not prioritize health sufficiently. ADNI does see progress in our global index 21, but also now looking at the results of FAP. So there are definitely steps being taken. If you look at new healthy products at portfolio level, we also see increasingly that companies adopt nutrient profiling models and assess the healthiness of their products. And bit by bit, it's not yet a lot, but it is moving, that companies commit to not market foods to children under 16. It's not enough though. If we look at the Global Index 21, only 30% of the products that we've assessed on healthiness using the Health Star rating system can be called healthy, and only 9% of the products can be called healthy to be marketed to children based on WHO standards. So also FAP mentioned that only 5 companies commit to increase sales of healthy food, and we very much like as ADNI to make that more. It's really our priorities for companies to produce more healthy and affordable foods, and at the same time commit not to market unhealthy foods to children, or not at all to children. How are we doing that? We're directly engaging with the companies through our tools, indexes, but also we work with other stakeholder groups to influence company behavior. We have an increasing group of institutional investors that signed up for our expectations on nutrition and health. And also we increasingly work with policymakers and organizations such as consumer organizations and Consumer International. We very much value our participation and collaboration with WBA, and we hope to continue this both by sharing data on the nutrition aspects, but as I just mentioned, also on the broader environmental and climate topics that are relevant. And I think that Victoria started with that, to bring the role of companies to international fora like the CFS, because these companies are and will remain an important part of our food systems, and therefore also need to be part of the solutions to improve food systems and reach eventually the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, and we're also happy from the WBA side to be complementing this data together on nutrition in specific. We'll move on to our final speaker, who will be joining us virtually, who's the Principal Project Manager at Proforest Africa, Afua Prempe. Can I have maybe the IT?
Hello.
We can hear you, I think.
Hi. Hello,
Yes.
everyone. My name is Afua Prempe, and I work in the Africa Regional Office of Proforest. I lead on programmatic work, and I am the native platform. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Afua, we can hear you. All right. Yeah, I'll ask you then the question directly on the panel. Um, so I think we heard from Sophie that there are different governance structures being set up to try to support the livelihoods of the farmers, women, and girls in particular in Central and West Africa. And we thought perhaps could you give us a comment on, the governance and engagement strategies that you would rather see that are positive or negative when it comes to sustainability actions from the companies and government engagement and policy environment? Is one of them enough? Do they both complement each other? Which strategy really works on the ground for the livelihoods of the people producing these commodities?
Can you hear me? I cannot catch everything, but I'd like to say that the need for government to be part of the solution, for private sector to work with government on it, because actually their work, both interventions from each stakeholders are very important and complementary, and key in delivering the positive outcomes that we are working towards. So the laws and legislation are essential tools that help to deliver on sustainability. And all companies at a minimum are required to comply with country legal provisions. Therefore, irrespective of what commitments companies make, its effectiveness really hinges on the presence of a favorable regulatory environment. Therefore, with the right information and understanding, and of course engagement, both private sector and government can harness their positive sides towards delivering on the targets that we work towards. And it also has implications for just transitions. And this is what you've been able to do through ASCI in most of the participating countries. So for example, in Ghana, that led to government and private sector working together to establish the Tree Crop Development Authority, which is government-led, but private sector-driven. So most of the leadership in that institution are actually led by local representatives of companies like Unilever or Nestle. So we believe that coordination and working together is important to delivering the positive outcome.
Thank you, Afua. This is very well noted. And thank you for giving us an example and at least a success story from on the ground, what is working in Central and West Africa. We have about 10 more minutes before we close it off. I'd like to open this up if the audience has any questions to be asking the presenters or the panelists as well. Please go ahead. We'll just give you a mic, 1 second.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is very important. I'll disclose who I am. My name is Marie-Chantal Messi. I work for Nestle. So I was happy to see us up there. So that's good. I do have one question and one comment. The question is for both Victoria and Mariah. You spoke a lot. I think everyone actually spoke about collaboration, and for me, I have two questions on how are you encouraging basically bridging climate and nutrition. I think we've heard that there's the ICANN yesterday. We saw that this is not happening. And so how could your organization actually encourage companies to bridge that more? So that my on collaboration, that would be one. And then also, and Mariah, I've heard that, I've said that before, but how are you encouraging companies that are either in the middle or at the bottom to actually level up? Because it's one thing to put the pressure on the top performers, but I think it's also important to level up and make sure that the others also feel that they need to act. So that would be my first question on collaboration. My second point is more on balanced diets, or the binary nature of healthy, non-healthy foods that are produced by companies. I think what we're looking is more at food is, yes, it's to nourish the body, but it's also a very big part of our culture, of our celebration, of pleasure, and this will not go away. So how can we integrate that part? And so I think for me, yes, it is absolutely important to increase the sales of nutritious food, but I think what is equally important to look at is how companies guide people in eating the more indulgent food, particularly indulgent food, in a more responsible manner. So whether it's portion control, portion guidance, calorie caps, responsible marketing to children. And I think we because this binary nature, we cannot have that. I mean, all of us have a little bit of gelato in the afternoon, or celebrate a birthday with a cake. So I think it's how can we mitigate that is by education and guiding people. So I think it's important that we have these two aspects, particularly because many of our companies, we produce ingredients that are part of a meal, of a larger meal, not necessarily food that are to be consumed by themselves. So it's very difficult to say that they're either healthy or non-healthy, but how are they consumed as part of a balanced diet?
Thank you for that question, Marie. Shall I take the collaboration one and you do the second? No, it's an interesting question, how to bridge the nutrition and climate. I'd say from a WBA perspective, what we try to do is we always emphasize food systems, that nutrition is as important as the climate metrics. So you also see that in the methodology. Environmental section is representing 30% of the score, and nutrition is 30% of the score as well. Actually, we have more topics in environment, so even the nutritional indicators are weighed very strongly. But that is an attempt. It's not a perfect attempt, and that's why also we work with an alliance of broader stakeholders, civil society, but also consultants, to go the step further, as we need to remain independent. But we do indeed also try to bring companies together on a neutral ground. You mentioned the sort of middle and bottom performers. From the 350, for example, 40% of companies actively engaged in this research process. So it means that they do care and they really want to make sure that they look well. There's also even companies in the top 25 that didn't engage, but that are very transparent and are doing really well. So it doesn't go to show how you perform, whether you are engaged or not. What we found useful is to bring different performing companies together in a neutral setting, and sort of non-judgmental setting, to bring in an expert on a certain topic, and then sharing the journey from a leading practice that a company has been implementing, also sharing its struggles along the way, that creating that pre-competitive phase, and for other companies to be inspired by what is already happening. As I said, sometimes it's very discouraging that it's only 4 companies here, 4% here, 8% there, but I feel very encouraged that it actually is at least happening. So that is the silver lining, that we do see good examples, and then by showing that it can be done, and hopefully especially among peers, and putting pressure also through investors and other stakeholders to mobilize companies to do better, is definitely on our radar, to make sure that the floor is raised as an entirety.
Yes, thank you. So maybe I'll then answer the question on the healthy versus not healthy products that are being consumed. I think there is, how to integrate not healthy food in diets. I think there's various factors. Of course, it's also about the availability. So if there is a lot of unhealthy foods in supermarkets, then it's easier for consumers to pick those foods than healthier options. So it starts with multiple actions to have more healthy options in supermarkets. And then at the same time, because we all know that there will always be chocolate or indulgent food available to as companies also to take responsibility in assessing the healthiness of your product portfolio, of communicating that clearly on your packaging, and by also consumer awareness creation activities. So to make companies more aware of what they eat and how much is possible in a healthy diet. But at the same time, because I think it's too easy to say, well, it's part of our culture. It's also companies, it's of course consumers. It's clear that they are being influenced by what is available in the market as well. So it's both these angles. It's what is there, and at the same time, awareness creation of consumers. Thank you.
Perfect. Yes, you had another question.
It's working. Good morning. I'm Matheus Zanella from the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. It's rather a comment, but first, Victoria and Ryan, the report is really important. I think the work you're doing really give us a sense of where we're going. I'm still trying to see if I'm seeing the glass half full or half empty, or 25% full. But it's interesting to see those numbers coming up. And we are a network of philanthropic organizations, and we also are trying to measure our investments in regenerative agriculture, coming up with a few interesting numbers that we didn't know ourselves. For example, we estimate that only 10% of our investments in food systems are really regenerative and agroecological in that sense. So it is a challenge to understand the picture on its entirety and see where really the investments are going. And I think one of the latest discussions we're having, we're a rather small piece in the puzzle. We are beyond the public investments, the private investments, and the philanthropic sector. We are still a rather small share, and trying to understand how to link that investment with where is needed. And we are happy to see, for example, that there are more, that FAO is taking very seriously, and now we're with this upcoming report on true cost accounting, the true cost of our food systems, because we only are seeing progress where there is return on the investment. So, for example, soil health, there's a clear return. If you invest in soil health, you get a financial return on it, but all the other investments, the return are hidden. They are based on externalities. The returns are not coming to the private actor, but to the society as a whole. And to clearly understand that picture is a challenge. So just to congratulate the work you're doing. Maybe you can catch up in other events and see how to make stronger links. Thanks.
Perfect. For the sake of time, we are 10 minutes over, so if you'd allow me to ask the Hub to please give a comment on what the Hub views its role in supporting the private sector engagement, especially with governments, but also your commentary on these data as well. Then maybe afterwards, please feel free to come up to the panelists and speak to them.
Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be with you this morning, and I want to thank Victoria and Ryan and all other panelists for putting this together. It was really instructive, and I think we need more of those events. You had learnings in your title, and I think the collective learning is extremely important. So I was very happy to see that there is movement on the climate front and that there is a little bit of progress there. Of course, we need to continue to say that nutrition is not getting enough attention, and we've seen today that it's one of the least performing sector. We should not oppose them, and I think some of the panelists have raised that climate and nutrition rather has to be integrated and seen together as important pieces of the progress that we are looking at. So just wanted to share a little bit of what I've gathered from what the various panelists have spoken about and what I see as important ingredients for us moving forward. And I think 5 elements particularly come to mind. First of all, the framework, the need for platforms, the need for government leadership, a human rights approach at the center, and also a multi-stakeholder approach. So first, we are looking at systems change. We are seeing extremely complex, extremely complicated issues, and we cannot approach this in a piecemeal manner. And that's where I really want to congratulate the World Benchmarking Alliance for this comprehensive approach to the issue, really building on what already is out there. And I think when it comes to frameworks, we really have to be looking at consolidating what is existing. Then we can try and bridge the gaps, but we need to leverage on standards that are existing. You mentioned them in your presentation, Victoria, but we also saw that recently ILO managed to get the policy guidelines to improve decent work for workers in the agri-food sector. That was last April. I think that was a major advancement, and we need to leverage on all these existing standards. We also saw how it's important to be unpacking what those standards mean, and I think it was you, Sophie, talking about how do we facilitate national interpretation of standards and making sure that countries and governments can embrace those, but also that companies can embrace those. So we need that clarity. We need that alignment. We need to be speaking the same language. And it's really by having those frameworks that we can all recognize ourselves in and that do not look like external things that are being pushed at companies that we can advance on this work. We also need platforms, and I was very pleased to hear from Paul also the work that the Food Security and Nutrition Task Force is doing. I think it is very important that we have these moments where we come together and that we are trying to speak the same language. And we saw from the question that you raised and the answer that we got that it is really by confronting different perspectives, different opinions that we can come to this shared understanding and the shared goals. I think there is value in having these platforms. There is value in learning. And as you were saying also, Victoria, in showing that it can be done. So we need more of those moments where we come together. Another element is the government leadership. We see the difference, especially with what Proforest has presented to us. Governments have to be at the forefront. First of all, because they are holding the legal frameworks, they are holding the regulatory progress that can happen. We had the example of deforestation and land rights. If governments are not active and playing an important role, we remain at commitments. And commitments are important for progress, but it should not be commitment-based only. We also need to make sure that within countries, there is this use, and we see how parliamentarians are getting more and more interested in this. And I think in a few weeks, we're going to see the first network of parliamentarians for food systems being launched in Africa. And this is also one way where we're making things progress when it comes to the regulatory framework. And I think it is very important that we are also looking at it from the incentives part. How do we send the signal that it is rewarded from the government's perspective, but also from investors to see that companies are ready to be accountable, but also ready to be transparent. And I think the transparency issue remains a problem about disclosing information and disclosing data. The human rights approach, very important, putting it at the center. Only 4% of companies are trying to bridge things when it comes to living income gaps. This is not an add-on. Actually, how can we have 2/3 of the agricultural workers being the poor workers? So we should definitely put this at the center, do much more. It's still one of the weakest areas. And as I mentioned, ILO has new policy guidelines that I would love to see unpacked for national conveners working on food systems, for other actors in the system, and the coalition, I think, that is led by IFAD Care and ILO. The Coalition on Decent Work can be a great partner there. And then the final ingredient is the multi-stakeholder approach, putting smallholder farmers at the center. The work that Proforest is doing is extremely important. We need to see more of that, and I think it is happening. But it is very important that we understand that when you're working and trying to work with an ecosystem, you're all coming with different interests, you're all coming with different agendas. I have seen, even recently, when we were preparing the stock-taking moment, that sometimes we don't feel comfortable being around the table together. We still have that important trust building to do. We still have that important work of coordination to do. It doesn't happen by itself. We need to be extremely intentional in doing that. We need to invest in it, and it takes time. So it is important that through meetings like this, we continue to make progress when it comes to the trust. Thank you very much. I know we are over time, so I'm not going to take more of your time, but I'm looking forward as the hub to be playing the role in helping to convene around this conversation, to make things gel, and hopefully being an important connector in building that trust and in accelerate the progress. Because definitely, I think it was Paul in his presentation that showed us where we are with the SDGs. At the midterm, things do not look good. We are looking at an increase in poverty, an increase in hunger, more and more people unable to afford a healthy diet. This is definitely not the direction that we are going to. So acceleration also means doubling down on investment. We are lucky to have our colleagues from IFAD and the World Bank in the room doing some important work on the means of implementation and the finance. And I think this also should be be part of the frameworks and the benchmarks. What are companies putting behind what they are committed to in terms of resources? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Sorry, for the sake of time, we couldn't take any more questions, but feel free to come up to the speakers and speak to them. Thanks a lot. A big round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much.